we're just in a different place right now where the Europeans are not going to follow just because the Americans decided on a stupid war that nobody understands, that now we have to join.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Focus, where we examine the strategic forces shaping our world today. Today, we are going to be looking at a question that is quietly, or should be quietly, worrying many policymakers across Europe. Could the current Middle East war reshape the Ukraine conflict? As the war involving Iran escalates, energy markets are once again under pressure. Oil has already crossed the psychological $100 per barrel threshold, and Qatar has declared force majeure on its liquefied natural gas exports. For Europe, which has spent the last several years trying to wean itself off Russian energy, this creates a potentially dangerous strategic dilemma. If energy shortages worsen, could some European governments begin reconsidering their support for Ukraine? Could Russia use the crisis to break Western unity in a way it couldn't have thought about, say, 2 weeks ago? And could Moscow actually benefit from the widening war in the Middle East? To help us unpack this, I'm joined once again by Danish naval officer, military analyst, and one of the most insightful commentators on modern warfare, Anders Puck Nielsen. Anders, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Anders, let me begin with a big strategic question. Russia's war in Ukraine has now dragged on for years, and despite sanctions, Moscow has shown remarkable resilience. But at the same time, European unity has also, perhaps surprisingly, held together in a way that many analysts for a long time had been doubting. But wars are dynamic and things change rapidly, often overturning long held beliefs. Wars are also contests of political endurance. So, Anders, from Moscow's perspective, is Russia now better positioned to wait out Western Europe before the inevitable fissures break the EU and NATO apart?
I mean, the war in the Middle East is absolutely good news for Russia in the sense that it boosts the oil prices, and that's basically what the Russian economy needs right now to keep going. They were just a month ago, things were looking really bad for the Russian economic outlook, and now things are suddenly much better. But I think in the big perspective, I will say that European unity is mostly a result of the fact that many countries in Europe actually do see Russia as an existential threat. And that means that it will also take a lot to break the European support for Ukraine, broadly speaking. I mean, definitely it will create dilemmas. It will make things more difficult. But the fundamental dynamics are still there, and the fundamental concern about how important Ukraine is for European security that has not changed. In fact, quite on the contrary, it seems that Ukraine now plays a everyone can see the pivotal role Ukraine plays in defeating these drones, right? That Iran has, and how being allied with Ukraine is suddenly also fashionable. So I think it's probably the way Putin looks at it. I think this is probably one of those things that he has been hoping for, right? That Putin's standard reaction when there is some situation he doesn't really know how to get out of it, it's kind of bad, is to just hang around and wait until something happens, some black swan event that will save things for him. And I think he's looking at the war in Iran and hoping that this will be it. But I doubt that it will. But it's definitely something that might prolong the Russian war effort.
We're going to be talking about the Black Swan a little bit later on because I think you've just raised something very interesting, a nice little segue for our audience. But, you know, is Russia betting that European political fatigue can now set in because Europe is faced with another energy crisis and one in which there is no real fallback? I mean, first there was Russia, then there was the Middle East, now there's what? The United States, Australia?
Yeah, I think it's not necessary. I don't know that fatigue is the right word. I mean, fatigue is a kind of passive thing that just kind of comes by itself, but this definitely leaves Europe in a vulnerable position where they are susceptible to Russian pressure, Russian coercion. So
Mm.
it opens opportunities that Russia can exploit. It makes it easier for Russia to wage hybrid war on Western Europe. I think they do understand by now that that is what it will take to break European support for Ukraine, that just waiting around is not going to do it. For a long time, they believed that the key to solving the European problem was to work with the Americans and that the Americans would have this influence on Europe. And that turned out not to be the case. And it's been evident for some time now that the Russians are getting really annoyed with the Western Europeans and how they keep supporting Ukraine. And if only the Europeans would stop doing that, then Russia could win the war. So this definitely opens new avenues for how Russia can put pressure on Western Europe. I think, interestingly, it's a kind of return to how things looked in 2022 back then in the first year of the war, until Europe got past the first winter. The Russians actually did believe that energy was going to be the key to breaking the Western determination, and they thought that the gas crisis in 2022 was going to lead to a victory in Ukraine because we would all stop supporting Ukraine and instead just prioritize cheap Russian gas. And to some extent, that's where we're back at now. That they are again setting their hopes that this might be that thing for them.
Okay, well, there's another issue that seems to be on everyone's mind at the moment, and that is the burn rates of sophisticated weapons that the Americans and Israelis have been, and even, the Gulf Arab states have been throwing at the wave after wave of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps ballistic missiles and drones. Many of these drones and missiles are at the cheaper end of the spectrum, but they seem to be punching above their weight because they have enough of them to allow for American, Israeli, and Gulf Arab burn rates to exceed what they can physically replace, at least in the short to medium term. Is there other lessons in terms of how Europe will need to defend itself against the likes of a revanchist Russia once the Ukraine situation's been settled? And what will Europe be doing to try to counter this? Because, modern weaponry today is expensive, it's complex, and in Europe, there's that extra layer of you've got a number of different countries all having to try to cooperate to build a thing, whether it be the Typhoon fighter. We saw only recently that the French and Germans are falling out over their sixth generation fighter program. So, Europe has complexities over and above what we would see in a place like the United States. So, how does Europe defend itself against, cheap ballistic missiles and drones?
Hmm. I think there are two different issues here, right? There is the defensive part of it and the burn rate and how much air defense the Gulf states and the United States and Israel are currently burning off, and how that might lead to a shortage of these things so Europe can get it at a later point. We might not be able to build the supplies that we need of especially something like Patriot missiles, and also how this might lead to a situation where Ukraine can't get those supplies. So there is a lot of focus right now on how Ukraine is supporting Middle Eastern countries in defending in a more cost-effective way against Iranian Shahed drones. But that's, of course, also in Ukraine's own interest to do that because it's not in their interest that these countries are burning off uh, PAC-3 interceptors that Ukraine needs, right? So there is that problem, and how it again just underscores the need that Europe really starts boosting the production of these things, and how we're just going to need so much more than we ever imagined that we would need. No, like once the war starts, we will need huge quantities of these interceptors, and we need to start stockpiling those. And I don't know that the Europeans are fully there yet. I think there is still in many places this idea that well, we need to rearm, but we also have to be realistic about how much and not waste our money on getting too much. And I could just say, once the war comes, you will need a lot more than you think. And that also goes into the other question, which is the more offensive side of things that you're also alluding to here, and how Europe really needs those capabilities as well. We have a serious problem in strike capabilities. What are we actually going to be hitting the Russians with? What missiles do we have? What drones do we have to throw back at them? And again, there, I think we are not fully at a point where we have understood the need for quantity, and how much it will be necessary to use to get the effects. And as you say, the Americans and the Israelis have been quite efficient in the first few days of the war in deploying a lot of that, but we just don't have those kinds of quantities, and that's definitely also something we need to focus on, and having a good high-low mix. So you have
Mm.
some very sophisticated missiles, but also just very large quantities of cheaper drone kinds of things that can hit. If we look at, with the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of focus on the big missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, or maybe the Flamingo missile, right? These kind of spectacular things. But if you look at what's really making the difference, it's more like those FP1 or FP2 kind of cheap drones that the Ukrainians are producing in large quantities for a low price. Like that's really the if there is a game changer, then that's probably more of a game changer than those high end systems. And I think we need to just also start thinking about that and acquiring those kinds of things as well across Europe.
So it's a funny kind of thing because I recall I got my PhD on Australian defence acquisition, and as part of that, I was tracing the patterns of defence procurement from 1963 to 1996, which was a particular wave of defence modernisation that Australia went through. And in the course of my research, I did a lot of work on the revolution on military affairs, that whole debate that took place in the United States in the mid to late 1980s into the 1990s, where the people who were in charge of the American weapons stables, the Lockheed Martins and the various other General Dynamics and so on, they were all sitting back saying, we could produce quantity, and we could do it at a way that it would still preserve quality, but let's scrub that. We've got a different way. With the miniaturization of electronics, we can cram so much more sophisticated stuff in our planes, in our ships, in our tanks, in our missiles, that we're just going to cram as much technology into these things as possible, and we don't need to have to worry about quantity, because the quality of the product will mean that once you get that F-16 in the air, or the FA-18 in the air, that aircraft is going to shoot down 5 Soviet fighters as they come over the horizon. That was the sort of mentality that many people in the United States had, and then they doubled down on that, because the kind of wars that the Americans fought in the post-Cold War era didn't require the sort of mass that you'd be looking at if you're planning state on state violence, right? So what does one do in a situation where the other side won? The people who were proponents of the highly sophisticated approach are in control of all of the major weapons producing houses in Europe and the United States. They're not going to go away in a hurry. And what you're suggesting is that we ought to be putting more of an emphasis on cheap stuff, which means that, some dude in a garage somewhere in Copenhagen would be able to, I don't know, put together a great piece of really cheap kit that could be mass produced very cheaply for the Danish armed forces, but that will also come out of the defense budget and may warp and twist the defense budgetary cycle against the acquiring of, say, an F-35 because they are very expensive and you can only ever afford a handful of these things, right?
Exactly. And so that's the big problem right now. How do you actually balance those two things? Because it's not like you don't need the high-end weapons anymore. It's just that it's not enough. I think one of the things that's really become visible now that we're back to large state-on-state conflicts is how resilient these things are and how much beating a country can actually take and still
Yeah.
stand, right? And this idea that you can just have very low quantities of high-end missiles and then that will be it. No, it's not. That's not going to happen. I think that's also what the Americans are really running into right now in Iran, right? They had an overwhelming display of military force in the first couple of days and very successful strikes, but then the Iranians are still standing. So what do you do now? So you need to have a good mix of these things, and I think the Ukrainians really have shown the way in terms of how they need to be thinking about this and can't just prioritize the very expensive stuff, but it's going to be a trade-off of, well, we need the, the the cheap stuff that can produce mass and allow us to really keep doing this for a long time and have an effect. So you have to think about how can you really in a cost-effective way get something that will get the job done well enough, right? And
Mm.
I think the whole transition. Ukraine has been through several transitions, and it's been interesting to see first the transition from Soviet era Russian equipment that they started with to sort of equivalent NATO equipment. So we saw moving from Russian artillery standards to NATO artillery standards, for example, but still artillery for artillery. And then after that, a transition to something else. Well, there is a shortage of artillery ammunition, and these things they're just also very expensive. So can we find cheaper ways of building something that will be good enough for most situations? And that is how we ended up with the FPV drones. Um, and then on top of that, you also have the challenge that how do you prepare for such a war as a country that is not at war yet? Because the technology that exists today is probably going to be outdated tomorrow. So we can't go out and invest in a ton of those drones that the Ukrainians are using because they won't work in a war in a couple of years. So you also need the defense sector to be prepared for this kind of innovation. You need to have enough that you can get the war started. You need to have supplies so that you can be fighting for, say, 6 months. So you prepare like the initial military force that you will be fighting with, but then you need to have the industrial base so that is ready to already from day one start producing and innovating and changing stuff so that very rapidly you will move the types of equipment you have in a direction where that just is better for the conflict you're actually in.
Anders, do you think that the European defense sector, or even the American defense sector for that matter, are nimble enough to adapt to these new developments that we're seeing in warfare, both in Europe and in the Middle East?
I think when we talk about the European defense sector, it's very important to remember that Ukraine is a European country. And I see them playing a vital role in rearming Europe. Um, right now, of course, they're consuming most of their output themselves, but we are seeing the Ukrainians actually starting to export weapons as well. And I think that will be a key to how we can build up a strong and sort of flexible European defense sector. And also, I think the cooperation between many European companies and the Ukrainian defense industry is very important in making this happen. So obviously, we see it's difficult for the industry in Western Europe to keep up with the pace that's going on in Ukraine. But I think we are seeing that they're doing their best, and we are seeing also that there is. I mean, it's not like the things that were produced in Western Europe is not relevant anymore. It's just a part of the whole mix, right? So I think if we include the Ukrainian defense industry into the wider picture of what European defense industry looks like, then um, Europe can be in a pretty good place. Of course, there's a war going on, but if we kind of get that settled in one way or another, it does look promising, I think.
There is something that rattles in the back of my mind about the interlinkages between what has been going on in Europe over the last 4+ years and what's just happened in the Middle East. And that is that initially there seems to have been a bit of a pushback by traditional European allies of the United States by saying no to, the UK said no to the use of UK bases, including the one in Diego Garcia for the US to actually use in their strikes against Iran. Keir Starmer has now made a bit of a turnaround and he's, thinking about deploying forces and has already deployed some forces in the defense of the UAE, for instance, which is, I think, a very good thing. We're starting to see France move in a similar direction. But for the time before 2 weeks ago, when this whole thing kicked off in the Middle East, Europe was only focused on Ukraine and keeping Ukraine up. But if we're going to start seeing a sort of reluctant coalition of the willing being built up, and eventually mission creep will do the rest, where Europe will start sending forces into a potential ground war in Iran, how is this going to actually help the Ukrainians in the end, because ultimately we have seen that many political leaders can't walk and chew gum at the same time. They can only be focused on one thing, but they can't be focused on two things because that just seems to overtax their mental resources. So, where do you see our strategy with regard to Ukraine if the war in the Middle East goes in a completely different direction? I mean, the Israelis have been promising us a lightning war, a blitzkrieg that'll be all over by, I don't know, it'll certainly be over before Christmas. And we'll all be celebrating the end of the mullahs. But what happens if that doesn't happen? How does that change the European security equation vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine?
Mhm. If the European countries get involved in a land war in Iran, a large invasion, and something that will consume a lot of resources, then obviously that would be bad for Ukraine because it will mean that many of the resources that they need will be diverted to something else. But I also think it's unlikely that that will happen. I think um, we've seen a lot of reluctance from the European countries in supporting the American and Israeli operation here. And I think fundamentally, there is a lack of understanding, or the European countries don't understand what the Americans are doing here, what the purpose is of this war, and also it seems quite obvious to most people why this would turn out to be a disaster. And so there isn't a lot of appetite on joining this mission, and I think we're also just in a different place now than with previous wars. I mean, just a few years ago, the basic concept was that wherever the Americans go, we will have to follow because they are our most important ally and the provider of security in Europe. That's just not the case anymore. And I think we live in an age now when the Americans might start realizing what having allies actually meant and how that was sometimes beneficial. Um, so I think we're going to see the Europeans here play a role where they really don't want to get super involved and they um, are going to do what they can to ensure that the economic consequences are sort of alleviated, that we can get oil into to the world market, things like that. But we're just in a different place right now where the Europeans are not going to follow just because the Americans decided on a stupid war that nobody understands that now we have to join. Uh,
Okay, well,
uh,
having said that, though, Anders, sorry, having said that, how much of a hit to transatlantic relations was Greenland? Because if what you're saying is true, this is really the end of what we would have always considered this strong relationship between the United States on the one side and Europe on the other. And because of all that sort of problem that we had with Greenland, was that the red line that Trump crossed that Europe then said, bugger it, we're going to have to go. We have to understand that in the new world, we're going to be alone more often than not. And certainly we won't necessarily be in military partnership with the United States for all the things that you've just said.
Mhm. I don't know how representative my view is on this because living in Denmark, like this was very, very central to us, right? But
Yeah.
definitely here, I can say there is a very clear, if you go and ask people on the street, they will no longer be talking about the United States as an ally. And people will say that we need to start treating the United States as a potential enemy. And I've not heard anything from the Danish government about just indicating any level of support for what's happening in Iran right now.
Mm.
So definitely things like that, but I also it just also comes into the whole there is a pattern, and the way that the United States has abandoned Ukraine and uh, neglected this thing that from a European perspective is our most important security threat right now, Russia, and how the United States is not standing shoulder to shoulder with us on this issue. I think these things, it's a broader picture here, right? And that there is no, I mean, there's no understanding for why we would need to get involved in a war in Iran that nobody really can understand the purpose of, and where everyone can just see. I mean, it was so predictable that this was not going to work and that this was going to lead to a global energy crisis, and the Americans stumbled into it. Um, so, so I of course, I think this can of course hurt the European economy, and it's also important in that sense that we have security interests in the Middle East, and it's very important to us to somehow get the Strait of Hormuz open again. But I also think it's important to understand that the war in Iran is not as important as the Russian threat is to Europe. We can actually choose not to get really involved in that. But Russia is the threat that can really undermine and totally change in Europe and destroy the European Union and throw us into a large, you know, war that stretches across the continent. And the war in Iran just can't. So there is something about prioritizing those things, and I do think that there is clarity generally in the political circles that what are the proportions here, and let's not get sucked into the thing that is not as important as the other.
Okay, so from what I'm getting, Europe has a Russia first strategy, which sounds reasonable, logical, and in every other way, I would support it. But what about this scenario? So you mentioned the energy crisis that everyone seems to be going through. I mean, I just went past the local petrol station earlier today, and I found that prices have really taken a big hit on the upward slide. So I'm kind of thinking that depending on Europeans' pain point, especially the governments, I'm not even talking about Europeans per se, not as a people or as polities, but as European governments, would they not be panicking at this point because, they don't have access to Russian oil and gas because of the Ukraine war. They may not have access to Middle East oil and gas because of the US-Israeli war against Iran. And depending on the amount of damage that gets caused in this war, we may be looking at the closure not only of Hormuz, I mean, that is in itself a problem, but we could be looking at the closure of, Qatari LNG for, I don't know, 6, 7 months. That's going to have a huge knock-on effect on the economy, which Europe is part of. So, I mean, there's no escaping the fact that people are going to be panicking in certain quarters. Wouldn't that actually be mill for the grist for Donald Trump because he just has to break a few things, watch the Europeans panic, and then all of a sudden the European leaders will all come cap in hand. Oh, forgive us, oh great one. You can have a weapon or two, or maybe we'll send some battalions across to fight your ground war to root out the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I mean, I can see a slippery slope here. Can you not see that, or am I completely off the reservation?
It's possible, but I would say that generally, I think the mood here is that this is a crisis that Donald Trump has created, right? So
Mm.
there's not really anger at the Iranians over this. It's really
Yeah.
the anger is directed at the Americans. So, and of course, America is then another supplier of energy. So we have to sort of do what we can to, as you say, keep good relations, right? We don't want to break anything here, but that said, I don't think there is a lot of enthusiasm about joining the war as such. We saw it also in I think it was 2019 when there was the whole crisis with the Strait of Hormuz again, where
Yeah. Yeah.
the Americans also wanted Europe to join their campaign against the Iranians, and the Europeans said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to set up a separate naval force to operate in the same area, but we don't want to be a part of this." I think that's more likely that we will see something similar to that, maybe under French leadership. I think back then it was French leadership. It might be again. So we will see naval missions, European naval presence, and those kinds of things happening, but in parallel to what the Americans are doing, because we don't really want to be sucked into it. I think that's more likely. And then, frankly, I think there is right now a sense that this is probably going to be solved before it turns into a massive problem here. That it's going to be I don't know. We're going to see Trump. We're going to see Taco Trump again, right? He is going to once he realizes how bad this is going to be, he's going to find a way out. That really, for American domestic politics, the last thing they need right now is a massive economic crisis. Right? That's not what Trump needs going into the midterm elections in the fall. So that they got into this war with this idea of a 3 day blitzkrieg kind of thing, and then it's going to be all over. And now it turns out that didn't work. So probably Trump is going to find some way to climb down the tree and declare victory. That seems more likely. And then that creates the let's see how it goes, and if the crisis goes away by itself. I think that's more the mood right now.
That may be the mood, Anders, and I'm going to have to push you on this point because, you
I
know,
mean, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, wars always start with the idea that this is going to be a quick one.
yeah,
That's how the Russians got into Ukraine, right? They
correct,
also
correct.
thought they were going to win in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Um, the choice the Americans are facing now is basically: are we going to do a land war? Are we going to do a real invasion here, or are we not? And I I tend to think that they are not prepared to do that. I think it will be difficult to see Donald Trump taking the country into. I mean, Iran is a massive country. It's 90 million people, right?
Yeah.
It's twice the population of Ukraine.
Mm.
Taking that on, I mean, that's just um, uh, the kind of amphibious force that would take. It's just an operation that the U.S. military is not prepared for right now.
No,
Um,
I agree with you, but there have been many people who have been talking about the potential fragmentation of Iran, looking at the various ethnic cleavages and thinking that perhaps, with US Special Force assistance or Israeli Special Force assistance, some of these, groups that do have armed militias can be up-armed and then turned into American and Israeli foot soldiers within Iran to fight the IRGC. We only had heard recently that there was a plan for the Kurds to get themselves involved in that, but I think that considering the the lack of faith the Kurds themselves have with the Americans, because multiple administrations have always seemed to have, thrown them under the bus at some point. I don't know whether that's on the cards, or at least maybe they haven't quite worked out the politics as well as they should to get a Kurdish commitment to go in as American foot soldiers. But with people thinking along these sort of existential lines, and the only way that you're going to root out the IRGC is going to be able to go in and take him root and branch out of the cities. You can't do that from the air. So look, I think you're right. I think there is the taco thing. I think that the international um, financial system, all of Donald Trump's Wall Street mates won't be particularly happy if he drums up a much wider war against Iran. However, in strategy, we've always got to sit down and think about the worst case scenarios, sadly. And that is really a worst case scenario where, in spite of ourselves, in spite of what we may think is good, reasonable, or understood, something beyond our understanding just overtakes us. And all of a sudden, we find, young men and women on the streets of Tehran. Possible, but hopefully unlikely.
Yeah, I mean it's possible. I think you're absolutely right that the idea was that this would lead to regime change in the sense that if they go in and take out the leadership, then the protests that we saw around New Year in January, that this would sort of this wave would again roll, and the Iranians would take out the government. There would be a new kind of government, and then they could work with that. But that has not worked yet. And then, of course, some people will be thinking about how do we bring that about. The problem right now is also that how do the Americans actually stop this again? And having killed the leader of Iran, and now his son being put in his
Yeah.
place, right? What kind of enemy are we facing right now? It's just probably an even more determined enemy, and someone who is, filled with anger and desire for revenge, right? And
Mm.
essentially, the Americans and the Israelis have legitimized the idea of killing state leaders, right?
Yep.
That and it's not just the Ayatollah himself; it's the whole family around him, right?
Hmm.
Is
Hmm.
just thinking about what this means for the security of Netanyahu's or Trump's families. Like the consequences of this are massive. So you can get caught up in these kinds of things where now the regime change is sort of almost necessary for this. But how do you actually bring that about? And can you do that with special forces in some kind of way? Can you try to assist this? What will it take? But um, right now, we don't really see anything indicating that that's in the cards, and um, it's not at all guaranteed that a Kurdish invasion or anything like that would necessarily help this. It might have the opposite effect of rallying around the flag effect in Iran, right? So
Mm.
it's really a very, very tough situation that they've placed themselves in. And in the meantime, the world economy is just crashing. And Donald Trump is looking at this. We know how sensitive he is to things like developments in oil prices, in the stock markets. And so it's really a bad situation. But yeah, I don't know. We will have to see. I think it's really difficult to see what the good solutions are.
Anders, do you think that there was an arrogance with regard to the Trump administration and Benjamin Netanyahu's government, to do what they did, thinking that they could get away with it, not only get away with it, but do it so quickly and in an almost historic manner? No one else has been able to do this, but we can do it. Look at us, look how powerful we are. No one can. pull us over a barrel or whatever. Do you think that there was this sort of arrogance of power and thinking of how to use the military instrument that will effectively backfire on both Netanyahu and Trump as this, if this war, no, if this war continues?
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, they were caught by this illusion that you can control these things in this very sort of surgical way. You can control war by as if it's a kind of computer game, and you I think Trump was very much caught in this sort of short war fallacy, this thing that you can use the military instrument, and then uh, because of your overwhelming might, you can just impose your will on everyone else. And I think that we've really seen Trump being more and more militaristic. It's kind of ridiculous to think that just a few months ago he was talking about how he wanted the Nobel Peace Prize, and he deserved that.
Yes, yes.
And since then he's just really gotten this appetite for military action all over the place, and living in this kind of fantasy world where America is so strong that they are that they can do everything, and somehow he got himself involved in this. And you could look at, right, this is not all that different from the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, for example. And it should have been obvious to anyone who has followed that doing something like this in Iran is going to lead to unpredictable outcomes, and it's not going to be as easy as you think. And but I think the mission in Venezuela, um, again, just sort of gave Trump appetite for more. It was so convincing the way they managed that situation, how they took out one leader and immediately there was another one in the functioning government, but just much more USA friendly. I think he had the same idea that the same would work in Iran without any sort of deeper contemplation of how Iran and Venezuela are two very different cases, yeah, just two very different countries, and how what works in one place will not work in another. And so the cultural sensitivity there was not very deep. Let's just put it that way. And this idea he that he's been floating, that he should be engaged in electing the new leader of Iran, right? We can maybe leave the regime in place, but he will choose the Ayatollah,
Yeah,
right? This
yeah,
it's just
yeah.
absolutely ridiculous idea. That's not how Iran works, right?
Well,
But
you
that's
don't
how
know. He is
Venezuela
actually.
works.
Yeah, well, I don't know. He did declare himself the president of Venezuela as well, didn't he? So
He did. Yeah.
in this weird world, anything is possible.
I mean, he could be the Ayatollah. Yeah.
Supreme leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Why not? Well. Okay. Look. Again, I have to ask this because there's been a lot of thinking by many quarters, including myself and some of my colleagues, with regard to is there a Trump doctrine? Now, why I ask this question is because people are starting to play connect the dots. And, it's a very compelling argument to suggest that, well, maybe Trump is really after China. He's going to deal with Iran in a way that will strengthen America's position when he meets with Xi Jinping next month. And if you take the God's eye view of recent history, the Americans got rid of Saddam Hussein. They initially got rid of the Taliban only for them to come back into power, but that's another story. But then they saw Syria fall and the Bashar al-Assad family, or the Assad family, I should say, uh, go. Then we've got Maduro taken out of Venezuela, always a thorn in America's side. Now we see American forces hitting and punishing Iran. It almost appears that someone dusted off the old neocon list. You remember that list where George W. Bush had like this whole list of countries and leaders that he wanted to knock off? And somehow it seems like that old thing is new again. We're starting to rumble with all of these old entrenched systems that we just don't like, but doing so is, there's a cost involved in doing so, and I'm not so sure whether we're going to stay the course here, for all the reasons that you mentioned earlier. But do you think that there is a case to be made that maybe in the deep state, somewhere in the United States, there are people far more intelligent than Donald Trump in terms of international relations and strategy that are trying to push a particular agenda internationally, that there is reason and sense behind what we are seeing and not just, the facile whims of an old demented man?
I think there are definitely, I mean, you can see that many of these countries are sort of, well, it's the same ones we were discussing 20, 30 years ago, but I
Yeah.
think there is a big difference in what the goals are, right? We're not talking
Mm,
about spreading democracy, for example, bringing
mm,
freedom to the people of these countries anymore. Now it's like, let's take Venezuela, for example. Trump took out a dictatorship, but he just installed another dictatorship, or
yeah.
basically he just put in another dictator. So it's not about really democratic values or anything like that. It's not about building global alliances. I think it's very important not to fall into the trap of sane washing what Donald Trump does.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
we can think about all these things about how there must be some kind of strategic rationale behind the decisions. And is this really about great power competition with China or something else? But essentially, I think it's mostly up to the administration itself to
mm,
explain why they are doing things. And I don't think they're doing a good job. I think it's very difficult to understand following what they've said. They've come out with like 8 or 10 different explanations for why it was necessary to start a war on Iran. And they're not even clear if this is a war or if it's a kind of special operation or what's really going on here. How long is
yeah.
it going to take? Is this about to end or is this just the beginning? Right? Yesterday they said both. So I mean, it's really difficult to understand where they are going, and I think there are many things at play in this. I mean, on the one hand, you are right that, of course, there are people in the MAGA movement and the whole Project 2025 thing that are have a very strong like intellectual powers, right? And who
Yeah.
understand international politics in a way that Donald Trump probably doesn't. So there are people influencing the politics and trying to further certain agendas. But it's all intermixed with also just Donald Trump's personal ideas about things. And it's about greed. It's about making money, controlling oil, energy. It's about personal, um, you know, likes and dislikes. I think a lot of what's going on with Iran is fueled by just Donald Trump's sense that there was unfinished business from his first term and how he just genuinely hates this regime and he wanted to set things straight, right? I think it's the same with Ukraine, that the personal dislike for Zelensky from the first term is very visible. Yeah, so Donald Trump just hates Zelensky, and that plays into strategic decision making. And so there are so many aspects of this. And is there a Donald Trump doctrine? I don't think that the doctrine is necessarily all that well thought out strategically. Um, I think it's more about being just fascinated by the military instrument and
Yeah.
having a not super deep understanding of what it can and can't do, but just being um, drawn into using this and the theatrics of appearing like a strong leader that everyone fears and that is important. Donald Trump seems to be really keen on those quick, clean operations where he can go in and demonstrate overwhelming force and then declare quick victory and then on to the next thing. And that's how Iran might be different because suddenly that was too big an opponent. And it might not be working here. So it will be interesting to see how he works on getting out of that. Um, but it does seem that that he has this kind of really fascination with the military instrument. But I do think you're right. There are definitely people in the circles of power in Washington who have a deeper understanding of these things. I think the national security strategy that they released in December, for example, was actually very well written. I disagree with almost everything in it. I think it was a very bad vision for what American security interests are and what are the threats to American power in the world. But there is a red line. I mean, this is clearly formulated, and somebody has a vision here. So
Mm,
I mean, it's not all coming out of nothing. But again, I will warn against it. We should not do the same washing of Donald Trump. It's not our job to come up with explanations for irrationality and making this sound more sane than it actually is. And I think it's ultimately the job of the politicians to explain why they are doing this or that. And they are doing a very bad job at explaining why there is a war in Iran.
yeah, yeah. Okay, if we go back to Europe and its oil and gas supply, and here in Australia, we've got a very big scandal at the moment. Well, at least it should be a scandal. It won't be because our media, well, I mean, it likes to talk the talk, but it really doesn't sort of focus on what ought to be done for the common good. I suppose it's not really their role, but at least as the fourth estate goes, they should have some sort of rational role behind this. We have less than 90 days reserve of diesel and petrol supplies in Australia, and Australia is an island continent. We've got our strategic reserve stockpiles in the United States, which will probably take about 90 days to get to Australia if ever we really needed them. And we also have to make sure that the American administration don't say, well, but we need the oil more than you do. So that puts us in a very peculiar position. In Europe, does Europe have a sort of a unified plan with regard to how it deals with energy security, or is this still at the nation state level? Do European nation states have their own strategic stockpiles of petroleum and diesel and gas? How does that all work for a non-European audience? Can you explain some of that to us?
Yeah, there is a lot of cooperation on these issues and building up sort of European stockpiles all in all, and everything is connected. Also, the
Yeah.
energy grid, the gas supplies, everything is connected here.
Mm,
So that's how it can sometimes be difficult to explain exactly what kind of gas. For example, in Denmark, we were very quick to say, well, let's get off the Russian gas. We're not going to be supplying Putin anymore. But the gas that comes out of the pipe might still actually be Russian because everything is connected in all this.
mm,
But still, the countries also have their own energy stockpiles, and there's a lot of discussion right now about are they big enough? Should they be bigger? Especially the gas reserves.
mm,
Um, we're just coming out of a very cold winter, and everything is low right now. And there is a big discussion about how we're going to need to find a lot of money over the summer to make sure that we have enough for the next winter, because we used a lot here, and if we are facing a global energy crisis, it might be really expensive to refill those. Uh, uh, that that there is a different components here where countries have the responsibility for doing this themselves, but also there's generally a lot of working together on sharing these things when you need it and being able to channel certain types of energy to the countries that for one reason or another find themselves lacking that. And then, of course, famously, we have some countries that have insisted on staying with the Russia's energy suppliers. So we have Hungary and Slovakia, most famously. And there is a lot going on right now where they they are facing the problem that the pipeline going through Ukraine was damaged back in January, and the Ukrainians don't really see a need to repair it. So uh, uh, some countries do find themselves in a kind of peculiar situation there, and then you actually do see the European Union trying to stand up for those countries as well, and saying, telling the Ukrainians, you should really repair this because it's important to European energy, even though generally the Europeans have agreed that we should not use Russian energy. The deadline for that has been the end of 2027. So there is about a year and a half left where the countries are actually free to use Russian energy. And for that duration of time, we actually find the European Commission sort of standing up for Hungary here and trying to argue that Ukraine should actually repair this pipeline. Um,
Mm.
but absolutely, I mean, it is a huge challenge how we do this. And I think going forward for Europe, and I guess for Australia as well, it's not sustainable to be dependent on
Yeah.
supplies of energy from unreliable suppliers. Right? We have the Middle East is currently showing how fragile that is. There is Russia, of course, which is not someone we can work with going forward. And then there's the United States, which is also unreliable by now as a supplier. So the green transition is just also security politics in Europe. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
discussion about how we really need to get those wind farms, those solar farms up and running as fast as possible so that we are less dependent on these unreliable suppliers.
Yes, well, um, speaking about green energy and the green transition, how scalable do you think they are to fix these gaps in the system? Because of course, renewable energy suffers from one thing, and that is it is intermittent. When the clouds are in the sky, solar rays don't reach the solar panels. When the wind drops off, then the turbines don't spin. Are we also looking at nuclear energy as part of that whole European mix? Because don't you need some sort of baseload power to run industrial Europe?
Absolutely. Nuclear power is, again, also on the agenda. And
Yeah.
um, nuclear power is generally seen as a green energy as well, which is kind of
Mm.
interesting, right? You're thinking about how
Yeah.
not long ago people wanted to close the nuclear power plants because of concerns about the environment, but now suddenly it's seen as part of the solution. But I
Mm.
will also say that with the number of batteries that are just everywhere by now, we are seeing that um, green energy is not necessarily that intermittent in how it can deliver power. We have just the number of batteries in electric vehicles, but also the batteries that can be installed for saving these things, and so you can distribute it across the days, or that is a part of the solution there. So you can actually have a lot of that, um, and not needing to have all the coal plants ready to be fired up again. So, but it's about having many different sources of energy that can, uh, cover for each other, and nuclear is definitely a part of that. Um,
Mm.
but however, either way you see it, I think the transition to electricity is very important as a way to solve some of these problems.
I don't want to play devil's advocate, but I will anyway. Say for instance, things go on in the Middle East and the fragile nature of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again in terms of making sure that there's safe passage for oil and gas out of the Strait of Hormuz just doesn't happen quick enough. Is there a possibility that Moscow presents itself as the solution to Europe's energy crisis? I mean, we spoke about the unreliability of certain actors in the world, Russia being one of them. But if things get really desperate, will Europe rethink its relations with Putin?
Some countries might. I mean, we definitely see that there is not across the continent a shared view of the threat from Russia. But I think that also we will see many people not accepting that, and I think those are the countries that are also most likely to be supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily see it changing all that much, but we're definitely seeing the Russians trying to capitalize on this. And we saw Putin the other day going out and saying, well, the Europeans have after all agreed that by end of 2027, they're not going to be buying Russian energy anymore. But with this new situation, maybe we should do that transition now. Why don't we just shut off the energy supplies to Europe right away and start selling it to other people who actually want Russian energy in the long run, right? And this is something that could really exacerbate the crisis here and now in Europe, of course, because
Mhm.
not all countries in Europe are ready for this. Uh, so I mean, it's absolutely something that the Russians could try to use, but I don't know that the solution overall in Europe will be seen as going back to Russian energy. And as I said, there's also a very deep understanding of how important Ukraine is to the security of Europe, and that is also demonstrated by the way the Ukrainians are now playing a role in the Middle East and in air defense, and how letting the Russians win in Ukraine is definitely not a solution. So
Yeah.
um, I, I think in general, I would say that this is an economic crisis that has come from the outside and where Europe doesn't really have all that much to do. And but in terms of we just need to stand through it, and eventually it will probably pass, and we will get the oil flowing through the straits again, and hopefully that it won't take too long. But
Fingers crossed.
yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah. Mhm.
Well, okay. Just finally on this one point, because I think it's an interesting angle to look at. I mean, even if parts of Europe wanted to go back to Russian energy, the question then becomes: could Russia actually deliver? I mean, Ukraine has been conducting long-range strikes against Russian energy infrastructure now for much of the war. How good are their refineries, storage depots, and pipelines? Because many of them have been repeatedly hit by Ukrainian forces. So can Russian oil really just switch back on and power whatever country in Europe wants to tap back into it?
No, not really. I think the way to use Russian energy is probably more in what the Americans are thinking about, and not that I'm saying that this is a good idea, but that is a more likely way. If you want to actually start using Russian energy again, then focus on bringing it to the world market, not necessarily the European market. So
Mm,
uh, letting the letting India, for example, buy Russian oil again and not,
mm,
being hit by sanctions, and accepting that it goes into China, and that will then have the secondary effect of reducing the demand from those countries for other oil, so the prices can go down. I think that's perhaps more likely, and I think that's actually quite likely that we will see the Trump administration taking these steps as a way to bring down the gas prices in the United States. Um, and obviously that will also be bad for Ukraine because it will give the Russians the ability to make money and sell their oil at prices where they actually make a profit, right?
yeah.
And so, but I think that's more likely than us seeing the European Commission in general opening up for this possibility
Mm,
of using going back to Russian energy. I think there's a clear idea that that's not the solution, and that the solution has to be more American oil if we
mm,
can get it, and that we need to focus on making sure that Iran doesn't hit ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, that we might have to set up missions to escort tankers, for example, through the
yeah.
straits or something like that. rather than going back to Putin.
And as reports are circulating that Russia may be assisting Iran in various ways, including potentially sharing intelligence or targeting data. I mean, if that's true, it raises a fascinating strategic question. Could Russia's support actually prolong Iran's ability to resist the West?
Oh yeah. Uh, I think there are several reasons for why Russia is doing that, but one of them is absolutely that it is in their interest that the Iranians are able to close the Strait of Hormuz for a long time.
Mm, mm,
They definitely want the oil prices to go up as a result of this. Now that the Americans have been so stupid to engage in a war here, then Russia might as well get the best out of it, and that includes creating an energy crisis. So that's one thing. And then I think it's also we should not underestimate the extent to which Putin genuinely
mm.
despises this American habit of regime change around the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
And
yeah.
this is the second time in just a few months that Donald Trump has done this. And Putin wants it to turn out badly for the Americans so that they stop doing it.
Mm,
uh, so, um, yeah, so Putin would like to see the Americans bogged down in a big war, right?
mm,
From a strategic point of view, it would be good for Russia if the Americans spent a lot of resources on this and not on other things. So I think there are many aspects to it. And one of those that I think is really fascinating is that we need to have a much more nuanced understanding of the relationship between Trump and Putin and American foreign politics and Russian than many people have. I think this story on social media about how Trump is a Russian agent or something like that, I think it's um, it's exaggerated in a way that's just not good. He clearly is not a Russian agent because if we look at how the United States is actually behaving on the world stage, it's actually only about Ukraine that they sort of have some common ground. But
mm,
aside from that, the American administration does all kinds of things that the Russians don't want. Um, so clearly, he's not just following orders from Moscow. So I think we are seeing here that this is an area where the Russians and the Americans just have very different interests, and the Russians really want to do what they can to obstruct whatever it is that Trump is trying to achieve.
Anders, I really appreciate the amount of time you've devoted to this podcast. I have one final question for you. Um, the big strategic picture. We now have two overlapping crises. We've got war in Ukraine, we've got a war in Iran. Both are energy wars involving the disruption of international supplies of oil and gas. Anders, are we a world at war, or are we in a world war?
I would say the first. I think it's I don't want to call this World War III, but because I don't think it resembles what those wars were, and I think it's important that we keep the perspectives straight here. I think we are definitely entering a more uncertain world. We're going to see much more turbulence. We're going to see many more wars, conflicts. And this is an indication of that, right? But I still think it's important to see it as quite separate wars that and not get too much caught into this idea that well World War III is already here. No, it's not. And I'm sorry, but if World War III actually comes, it's going to be much worse than what we see right now. Uh,
Worse. Oh my God.
uh,
Okay.
no, I mean,
Mm,
just
mm,
the casualty numbers that we have on our side are very, very low. I mean,
mm.
uh, we're talking single digits still, right? On the
Yeah.
American side in this war in Iran, we're talking like we're not even actively engaged in the war in Ukraine. Um, so I think it's important that we keep the perspective here that once we all start taking casualties at the rate that Russia and Ukraine are doing right now, well, then we can talk about World War III. But let's not call what's going on right now. Let's not pretend that is on the scale of what we saw in World War II.
And as always, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus. You know, you always bring something extremely valuable to the program. So thanks.
Well, thank you too.
And now on to questions for our audience. Do you think Western Europe will maintain its support for Ukraine as long as it takes, or do you believe political fatigue will now set in? If Europe were facing a severe energy crisis, should governments prioritize supporting Ukraine or stabilizing their own economies first? Do you believe renewable energy can realistically replace oil and gas quickly enough to protect Europe from geopolitical energy shocks? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, on iTunes, and on Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Siah. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at Bruni Doctor, and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on the Focus Pod adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.